Backstage at the Las Vegas Hilton, 1976, the king was minutes from walking on. A frail woman, wrapped in a shawl, gripped his hand. Her voice barely carried. "I might not see Christmas." Elvis froze, and then he leaned in. "Stay with me." Because the next few minutes show how a single conversation, a scarf, and the corridor behind the Las Vegas Hilton showroom wasn't built for running. Still, a stagehand in a headset came barreling around the corner, nearly clipping a wardrobe rack. "Elvis," he said, breathless, "there's someone you might want to meet." It was August 1976. The Hilton was sold out for the third night. In a row, the air backstage was warm and thick, smelling faintly of hairspray, cigarette smoke, and the faint tank of metal from the mic stands. Somewhere beyond the heavy curtains, 18,000 voices merged into a steady chant. "Elvis, Elvis." Near the sound racks, in a plain folding chair, sat a woman in her 70s. Her shawl, pale blue and thin as tissue paper, draped over bony shoulders. An oxygen tube curled along her cheek and disappeared under her collar. Her daughter stood behind her, clutching a worn manila envelope like it was something fragile. Witnesses. Recall that Elvis didn't hesitate. He stepped away from his dressing room doorway and crossed the narrow hall. His boots made almost no sound on the low-pile carpet, but the gold in his rings caught the light from a bare bulb overhead. When he reached her, he didn't tower over her the way most men might. He lowered himself until they were eye to eye. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and warm, "how you doing tonight?" She smiled, but her lips trembled. "I've been waiting my whole life to tell you something." The room seemed to shrink. From somewhere down the hall, the band struck a few warm-up notes, a burst of guitar, a test thump on the bass drum. The sound rolled under the floor. Mixing with the distant crowd noise, she began speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. The daughter leaned in, listening. Elvis's gaze stayed locked on the woman, nodding slightly as if urging her on. Halfway through her sentence, an impatient stage manager slipped in beside them. He tapped his watch sharply, the motion quick, urgent. "We've got 2 minutes, E." Elvis didn't move. The woman's fingers, thin as bird bones, tightened around his hand. Her skin was cool, but her grip had a surprising steadiness. In the corner, the daughter shifted her weight, the envelope still pressed against her chest. Its edges were soft from years of handling. Elvis tilted his head closer. "Go ahead, darling," he murmured. She swallowed hard, then said something that made his eyes change, the kind of subtle shift you only notice if you're right there. A flicker between surprise and deep, quiet sorrow. It wasn't about music. From down the corridor, the MC's voice boomed through the monitor speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Hilton Hotel is proud to present." The crowd erupted, a wave of sound pressing against the walls. Elvis stayed kneeling. The stagehand glanced toward the curtains, then back, clearly torn. "E, they're ready for you." But Elvis didn't seem to hear. His thumb brushed lightly over the back of the woman's hand, a small, grounding gesture. "We've got time," he said softly. She leaned in again, her breath shallow. What she whispered next wasn't about music at all. The roar from the showroom seeped through the walls like a living thing. The floor under their feet trembled, with each stomp and clap from the crowd. The woman's lips were so close to his ear now that only he and barely her daughter could hear her. "You got me through nights I didn't think I'd survive," she said, each word slow, as if it took more strength than she had left. Elvis blinked, his focus narrowing in. "How's that, honey?" She told him about long months in a hospital room, the beige walls, the steady, mechanical beep of monitors. The nights when sleep wouldn't come because the pain did instead. In those moments, she said, she'd reach for her small transistor radio. It was old, the dial worn smooth from her fingertips. And every night, she said, they played you. The hum of the crowd outside became a muffled ocean in the background. She mentioned one song in particular, Can't Help Falling in Love. She said she played it on repeat until the nurses joked they knew the words by heart. But it was the only thing that made the pain fade. She whispered. Elvis's jaw tightened slightly, not in discomfort, but in the way someone does when holding back emotion. His hand covered hers, and the weight of it made her arm relax. Just a little, his thick gold rings, warm from his skin, pressed gently against her knuckles. "What's your favorite part?" he asked, leaning in closer. She smiled, just barely. The last line, always the last line. For a beat, he didn't respond. His eyes studied hers, like he was trying to memorize the color. The band's intro music burst louder now, the unmistakable swell before the curtain rise. The stage manager was back, more urgent this time. They're starting without you." Still kneeling, Elvis reached over and brushed the edge of her shawl with his fingertips. "I'm gonna promise you something," he said. The daughter's eyes widened slightly. He lowered his voice so only the two of them could hear. Whatever he said next made the woman's breath hitch and her eyes glisten. The daughter would later say she'd never heard a tone in his voice like that before, part vow, part prayer. Then, like flipping a switch, he glanced toward the stage, nodded once, and rose to his feet. But before he turned away, he squeezed her hand again, not a casual squeeze, but a steady, anchoring one. "You'll know when it's happening," he told her. The woman tilted her head, curious. He was halfway down the hall before she understood what he meant. From behind the curtain, the house lights began to fade. The spotlight operator readied the first cue. Elvis took his mic, his face unreadable except for the faintest smile in the corner of his mouth. He wasn't just going to keep that promise, he was about to change the show for her. The house lights dropped to black. The crowd erupted, a wall of sound that rattled the hanging lights above the stage. A single spotlight snapped on, cutting a white column through the smoke-hazed air. Elvis stepped into it, white suit catching, the light in crisp flashes, but instead of the usual opening banter, he adjusted the mic stand, looked out over the crowd, and said, "This one's for a very special lady tonight." The camera operators, quick on instinct, swung their lenses toward the front row. There she was, pale blue shawl, oxygen line catching the glare, eyes wide in disbelief. The daughter's hand rested protectively on her shoulder. Gasps rippled. Through the nearby seats, people leaned in, whispering. The band paused, waiting for a signal. Elvis turned toward them and gave a short nod, not for the song they were set to play, but for something else. The first gentle chords of Can't Help Falling in Love drifted into the air from the very first line. Elvis's eyes kept returning. To her, he didn't scan the room like he usually did. His focus stayed locked, as if the rest of the audience had vanished. Halfway through, he stepped off the stage. Security instinctively shifted, but he waved them off with one hand. The crowd leaned forward in unison, 1,000 tiny creaks from seats tipping toward the aisle. He made his way to her row. The spotlight followed, scattering dust motes in its beam. The air was thick with perfume, cigarette smoke, and the faint smell of the stage's hot electrical equipment. Kneeling in front of her, Elvis held the mic low enough that her soft humming could be heard. The arena fell silent except for their two voices blending, his deep and steady, hers thin but unshaking dot in that moment. The distance between star and fan didn't exist. Then, with no pause in the music, Elvis slipped the white scarf from around his neck. He draped it over her shoulders, the fabric still warm from stage lights. Her free hand came up to hold it in place, fingertips curling into the soft weave. He kissed her forehead, a quick, gentle press that drew a collective breath from the audience. And for just a second, his eyes closed as if sealing the moment in memory. The crowd, sensing something rare, didn't cheer right away. Instead, there was a beat of silence, and then a wave of applause rolled forward, starting in the balcony, and crashing toward the front row. The band swelled into the final refrain. Elvis lingered there for one more line before standing and making his way back to center stage. The woman leaned into her daughter, smiling through tears. The scarf was still warm against her skin. On stage, Elvis finished the song, the last line, held just a fraction longer than usual. He set the mic back on its stand and gave one final glance before the lights shifted for the next number. What no one in that audience knew, not even most of the band, was that the scarf wasn't the only thing she'd take home from that night. 3 days later, in Henderson, Nevada, the summer heat pressed against the windows of a small, single-story home. The daughter had just returned from the pharmacy when she spotted it, a large cardboard box sitting squarely on the front porch. No return address. She hesitated. Most packages they got were small, mail-order medicine, oxygen tubing, the occasional letter from friends. This one was big enough to hold a small TV. Inside, her mother was resting in her recliner, scarf still draped across her shoulders from the Hilton show. She kept it there even while she slept, fingers occasionally brushing it as if to check it hadn't disappeared. The daughter called out, "There's something here for you." They carried it inside together, setting it on the coffee table. The box was sealed tight, heavy for its size. A faint scent of cologne clung to the cardboard, the kind you catch in a dressing room full of hanging suits. She cut the tape with kitchen scissors, the sound sharp in the quiet living room. Inside, a neatly folded white stage scarf, pressed between two vinyl records. Both were pristine copies of Elvis, a legendary performer. The glossy sleeves still smelled faintly of fresh ink. On top, a single cream-colored envelope. Her mother opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a note in bold, slanted handwriting. "You'll always have a seat in the front row. E." The woman pressed the paper to her chest, eyes closing. "He meant it," she whispered. From that day on, the records were kept beside the old turntable in the corner. Every morning, she'd ask for one of them to be put on. The sound of that opening track would drift down the hallway while sunlight cut through the blinds. Some afternoons, she'd ask for the scarf to be laid across her lap so she could trace the fabric with her fingertips. It was more than cloth now. It was proof that, in a room of thousands, she had been seen. According to the daughter, those records became the soundtrack to her mother's final months. Nurses who visited began humming along when they heard them. Friends who stopped by were shown the scarf before anything else. The promise Elvis made backstage hadn't just been kept, it had followed them home. In late autumn, her health began to fade quickly. The scarf stayed with her until her last night. She kept it beside her pillow, one hand resting on it even as she slept. The funeral came a week later. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood. Guests filed past the casket, expecting to see the pale blue shawl and white scarf tucked alongside her, but the scarf was gone. When someone asked the daughter about it afterward, she smiled softly and shook her head. It's on its way somewhere else. It was early evening when the daughter walked back into the Hilton showroom, the same place where just months earlier her mother had sat in the front row. The stage was dark now, rows of empty chairs fanning out toward it. In her hands, a small sealed envelope. She approached the hotel manager, a man who had worked there long enough to remember every residency Elvis had done. I want you to give this to someone who needs it, she told him. Inside the envelope was the white scarf, folded carefully, just as it had been when it first arrived in their home. Alongside it, a short note. This brought my mother joy in her last days. Please pass it to someone who needs hope. The manager looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. I'll make sure it gets where it should. Weeks later, backstage before another Hilton show, a crew member handed a package to a young woman. Seated in the wings, she was battling an illness of her own, too weak to stand in the crowd. The scarf, still carrying faint traces of stage cologne and her mother's perfume, was draped over her shoulders. Some say Elvis himself heard about it that night. Witnesses recall a small smile spreading across his face when the story reached him. That's what it's for, he reportedly said. From then on, the scarf became a quiet legend among the Hilton crew. It wasn't kept in a display case or locked away in a collector's safe. Instead, it was passed quietly from hand to hand, always to someone who needed it most. One man's pause backstage had turned into a chain of moments, each carrying the same message her mother had felt. You are seen. You matter. For the daughter, knowing the scarf's journey didn't end with her family was the real gift. The music had reached her mother first. The gesture had carried her through the end. And now, the kindness was outliving them both. Sometimes, the smallest act in a crowded room can echo longer than the loudest song. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes a single act of kindness can outlast a lifetime. Have you ever had a brief moment with someone famous that stayed with you forever?